Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on the importance of inclusivity in both the process and outcomes of Afghanistan's future political settlement. Today's event is hosted by the Atlantic Council and the Afghanistan Mechanism for Inclusive Peace, a platform designed to create a channel between the Afghan people and the negotiators. My name is Marika Theros, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, as well as a researcher on peace and conflict at the London School of Economics. Today, there's much discussion in Afghanistan and beyond on the potential of a peace process to end the current violence. Since the February 2020 agreement was signed between the US and the Taliban, there's been significant debate and advocacy over the viability of the peace process, its sequencing and composition, its starts, and significantly, how to ensure that the process emerges in a way that represents the voices and interests of a diverse society, and in particular, women, minority, and civil society. Today, with the violence on the rise, the prospects for peace may look dim, but civil society and the Afghan people continue to work hard to raise their voices and to try to create the conditions for a viable process. We will hear from our panelists where we are with the peace process, why inclusivity matters more now than ever, how the Afghanistan Mechanism for Inclusive Peace, or AMIP in its short form, is seeking to fill this gap, and importantly, what the priorities and demands are of different constituencies in the country. I'd like to start first by introducing our very distinguished panel of speakers. First, I'd like to introduce Ms. Mariam Safi. She is the co-director of AMIP, and she is also the founding director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies, a research and training institute based in Kabul, Afghanistan. Next is Mr. Masood Karakhel. He is also the co-director of AMIP and the director and co-founder of the liaison office that's been established in 2003 in Kabul, Afghanistan. Lima Anwari is a member of the steering committee of AMIP. She currently supports the work of a number of civil society groups, including the Young Leaders Forum and the Afghan Women's Network. Then turning to Mr. Syed Hussein Anush, he's also a member of the steering committee of AMIP. He's a civil society activist, rights defender, and the executive director of the Civil Society and Human Rights Network. Last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Antje Herberg, who's a senior mediation advisor at the European External Action Service. She has over 2 decades of experience in mediation and previously served as a senior process design expert at the UN Department of Political Affairs. For longer bios, please see our website. But thank you all for joining us today. And without further ado, I'd love to start the conversation by asking Ms. Mariam Safi if she could start us off by giving us a little bit of background on why AMIP was set up, the work it does, and what it is doing now to address the critical question of inclusion in the Afghan peace process.
Thank you very much, Ms. Theros. It's a pleasure to be here today from AMIP in this webinar, and of course, it's at a very critical juncture. To answer your question, I'm going to go back a little bit on what propelled the development of AMIP, if I may. And then I would like to go down to some of the work that we've done, and then furthermore, to talk a little bit about the concept of inclusivity itself and the challenges this has posed in this environment. In 2018, following the appointment of a US Special Representative for Peace and Reconciliation and a readiness to negotiate a peace agreement with the Taliban, the peace process gained considerable momentum, breaking a stagnation that had plagued the process since 2010. Now, following alongside this political momentum, where civil society organizations, in particular women's network activists, welcomed the start of the talks, there still had remained very cautious of the discussions, the compromises, and ultimately what this peace could mean for Afghan society. As such, civil society actors did very much mobilize, and quite quickly and efficiently, in organizing consultations and producing papers for them to ensure that the Afghan voices reached the negotiations table and were incorporated in the US Taliban agreement. However, the agreement showed to us that these calls had fallen on deaf ears. It also illuminated a gap amidst the ongoing and impressive efforts of civil society actors. Now, that gap was the absence of a technical mechanism that could act as an interface to bridge the track 1 negotiations with civil society actors, grassroots actors, and of course, the rest of Afghan society and Afghan population. Now, the absence of such a transfer mechanism meant that there was no single platform to manage the inclusion aspects of the peace process in a structured, systematic, and of course, non-partisan manner. Thus, calls for a mechanism began to emerge and gave way to the birth of the Afghanistan Mechanism for Inclusive Peace, which began its efforts in the spring of 2019. Now, AMIP is an independent and impartial transfer mechanism created by a consortium of Afghan civil society organizations, spearheaded by a steering committee of civil society actors, half from Kabul and half from city centers. And AMIP began to fill this gap of making sure that, one, critical information and public sentiment analysis on important issues were transferred to both negotiating parties. I'd like to mention here that AMIP has a focal point in an MOU with the Republic negotiating team, and is also talking with both sides in this factor. Now, this had enabled track 2 and track 3 and the public to have their voices heard at the negotiating table. Now, this how we do this and how this came about in terms of transferring these voices. Now, this comes in various forms. First, joint action plans, draft agreements, position papers, summaries of consultations, and expert witnesses. Second, through its steering committee, its General Assembly, and its regional nodes, which are located in the 7 zones of Afghanistan. It is able to reach the farthest corners of the country, including Taliban-controlled territories, to streamline civil society actors' perspectives into the track 1. Third, while partnering with civil society actors and networks to ensure consultations are relevant to the peace process needs, AMIP also consults with the negotiating parties to ensure the same. And lastly, also has a very important feedback loop that connects the track 2 and the track 3 with the track 1 when transfers do take place. Now, thus far, our gatherings have included facilitating with partner organizations consultations such as civil society and media consultation that we had held in September, a day before the kickstarting of the peace talks. And it was to show support from civil society that dialogue is truly the means to end the conflict that has plagued Afghanistan. This was followed by the Afghan Women Leaders Peace Summit in Dubai, which was organized by the Afghan Women's Network, and where for the very first time we were able to bring women from the provinces, the city center, and the diaspora together to both to discuss and to strategize and to identify their demands from the table. And this was back in November. Now, following that, we've had several consultations like our Turkmen summit, which was held in Mazar Sharif, our Persons with Disability and Victims event that was held in Western Afghanistan, with organizations based in the provinces and organizations based across the country. And in the very near future, we are looking forward to holding similar events. And these events are those that come to AMIP from civil society organizations who feel that there is a need to get this voice, whether it's the voice of minorities, of women, of youth, of religious scholars, of media, etc. We held a very important event that I'd like to note here about a month ago, and it was called the National Peace Gathering. And the National Peace Gathering was sort of sandwiched between the release of the US points for a peace agreement, and then talks of an upcoming Istanbul conference, which, as you know, was then delayed. When we looked at this agreement, we recognized that there was no mention of inclusivity or civil society voices in that process. And then we had Istanbul coming up. So we decided to bring together over 1,400 track 2 and track 3 actors, half from across all 34 provinces, to identify what they felt was their sentiments to be expressed at the Istanbul event. And these dealt with issues like governance, ceasefire, the role of the international community, etc. And we released a statement shortly after that on those, and a much more extensive report thereafter. Events from AMIP are going to be continuing to be held with these various sectors, and the events that we hold are always timely connected with what is being discussed at the table, so it's relevant for both track 1, 2, and of course track 3. Now, the imminent US troop and NATO troop withdrawal from Afghanistan has seen increasing fear and anxiety grip the Afghan population, as there is no political agreement in place and the future is acutely unclear. AMIP's role, we believe, in this environment has become even more important as Afghan society is desperate to make sure that the parties hear their views on what a future Afghanistan should look like, and indeed what transitional arrangements should be put in place. Now, here I'd like to talk very briefly about this concept of inclusivity and what are sort of the challenges we're facing in this process. Now, inclusivity, as you know, Marika, is a very complex and highly difficult concept to deconstruct, and one that kind of gets thrown around a lot these days. Now, first, for us, every voice is important and must be heard, but not everyone can sit at the table, of course. Second, in a peace process, local voices tend to be politicized by the parties and the stakeholders involved, where each takes into consideration those views that support their mandate while rejecting the rest as unrepresentative. Now, both of these pose challenges for us. Individuals feel like their voices are heard when they are sitting at the table. Now, while AMIP can't get millions of individuals at the table physically, we are able to get voices across to the table with the support of civil society organizations, of course. Now, these poses real challenges for civil society actors as well in AMIP as a mechanism, and mostly on how it can balance these voices while ensuring all inputs are heard at the table. That's, I would say, the crux of the challenge that it creates for AMIP. Now, guided by the principles, of course, of impartiality and inclusivity, AMIP works with all sectors of civil society to ensure that, like I mentioned, we can get as many voices to the table as possible. However, this is not without its difficulties, but what is most important here to recognize, and which has been reflected time and again in all consultations, including the one that we just facilitated, the National Peace Gathering, is that, and I quote, this is from one of the participants of our National Peace Gathering, is that a peace in which Afghans do not see their own reflection is one that will not be sustainable. And this has been reiterated consistently to us at AMIP. And so what we are trying to do with civil society organizations across the country is to make sure that that reflection is there and is also heard. And I'll stop there. Thank you, Marika.
Thank you, Miriam. I'd like to now turn to Mr. Karokhel to give us a little bit more about the current context. Since much of the intra-Afghan talks over the last 2 years have been very volatile and unpredictable. As Miriam Safia has mentioned, the Turkey summit in May was canceled or delayed, and now we're hearing sort of reports that new talks may emerge in Doha or Istanbul. So could you tell us a little bit where does this peace process stand today? And also how is AMIP responding and adapting to these challenges, in addition to some of the work that Miriam mentioned? Thank you.
Thank you, Marika, for the question and this opportunity. Obviously, as you know, as you just said, the peace process has been on a roller coaster ride, sometimes moving very fast and sometimes moving very slow. And AMIP has to maintain that peace and that pace to work at that level. That means both in channeling the voices to the negotiating sides, but also in a situation when Afghanistan insecurity is rising day by day. Targeted assassination increasing, I think it's becoming harder also for various actors within the civil society to come forward in an atmosphere where they can constructively work to share their voices. At the moment, our understanding is that there is a new chance or a new hope that the Afghan negotiating or the Republic negotiating team, which is now back in Doha, that it will lead to the very distant positions that both sides have, that there is some level of agreement on an agenda to take forward. I think we had a lot of hopes that the Istanbul summit would have happened, which Maria Maldi spoke about. I think that not happening and the US troop withdrawal for September and no clear political settlement yet existing has created its own turbulences inside the country. On one side, we saw escalation in violence. On the other hand side, we saw different efforts being taken by international and local actors on creating a united front or some sort of a national consensus to represent the Republic side. Taliban side as well, we saw that there was less interest towards attending the Istanbul summit, and later on, we are not sure if now the talks will be taking some sort of a confidence building measure, I would say, probably happening in Doha. So the focus is somehow back to Doha and the two negotiating teams trying to carve out an agenda. But till that happens, and the events in Afghanistan play an important role on that, because the Taliban are also responsible to their side, and the negotiating team is also responsible back to the actors which are in Kabul. And this arena is always we see shifts and counter moves. What happens on the military front directly impacts what happens at the negotiating table, especially regional powers like China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, of course, and of course, United States, the European Union, UK, and others all have a variable role in this peace process. So it's not only limited on the domestic factors, but also regional and international factors. We have the new UN envoy in town who's meeting civil society actors. My colleague Marcelo had a chance to speak to them. So the uncertainty is still very much there, and I think the gap between the two sides is still very much at a distance till we arrive at a situation where there's an agreement on that. And within that, I think one of the sticking points is a political settlement or a roadmap for post-September. And secondly, is another sticking point is a ceasefire. We saw in the last Eid, again, a 3-day ceasefire. We saw a great opportunity and hope again emerging. But just right before Eid, we had the horrific attack on a school here in Afghanistan, which already dampened the spirits of a possible peace in the near future. So these kind of attacks inside Afghanistan, regardless of who is committing them, is further diminishing local hopes of a possible ceasefire that may happen, and that's beyond 3 days, could be over 6 months. I think that kind of a ceasefire will create a more situation of stability inside the country. Also show that both sides are meaningfully looking towards a political settlement, and I think that will have a direct impact on the local population here, but also on the fragile security and political situation that we have inside the country at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Masood. May I ask a quick follow-up question? You mentioned, a lot of a lot of external factors that are playing into what is intended to be intra-Afghan talks and a domestic process. There's also been no facilitator or mediator to this process. How is AMIP in this challenging environment? How is it perceived by the different negotiation teams? And how and do you also direct your advocacy, which I imagine you do, beyond just the negotiation teams?
Yes, I would say for AMIP, trying to be the transfer mechanism and trying to work with both sides. And as a mechanism, although the liaison office and DROPS are more longer standing organizations, AMIP was still a new mechanism that was launched in collaboration between these two organizations, and of course with an inclusive steering committee and a broader civil society representation that my colleague earlier covered. I think for us it is to prove our value in this process, to demonstrate that. That all the activities my colleague earlier mentioned, from the Turkmen event to the National Peace Gathering, are events that shows that yes, AMIP can work under difficult situation, can keep the pace with a fast-moving or sometimes a very slow peace process in terms of delivering local voices to the table, including analysis. Our discussions with the Taliban political commission or Taliban negotiating team in Doha was very productive and constructive, I would say. We had our steering committee members that were also in these meetings with us. We explained the role of AMIP. So far, that process is still working on confidence building with them. With the Republic negotiating team, my colleague earlier mentioned, we already have an MOU. So we are trying to feed these two sides with information that we are collecting from the ground, or funneling that back to the negotiating sides. But in the meantime, we're also engaging all other international actors that are engaged as well. That means from the Norwegians, the German envoys, UNAMA as well, or any other platform that we find actors that are interested or want to be engaged in Afghanistan, is to speak with them and share their views of the Afghan population in an impartial manner. I think we are very much open to all sides when we come on the ground. I mean, Afghanistan has a diversity of views and, and provinces having different dynamics. So I think for AMEP, still the key challenge is to demonstrate that, yes, we can work in such a difficult environment, both in government-controlled contested areas and Taliban-controlled areas, in terms of engaging local communities. So that remains paramount, and AMEP is very much looking towards that. Thank you. Thank
you. I'd now like to turn to Ms. Lima Anwari. Afghanistan has one of the youngest, fastest growing populations in the world. Over 78% of its people are younger than 35. One of the statistics that always strikes me is that nearly 21 million were born in 2001 or later. In addition to youth, women's rights are clearly at stake in this process. If you could tell me a little bit about, not only about how AMEP is engaging with youth and women in particular, but if you can share some of the priorities and perspectives with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here in this webinar. As per the title of the webinar here, we are to discuss the importance of inclusivity in the Afghan peace process. But before jumping to the women and youth inclusion to the process, I would just like to state that for any important work, there is a need to consider some main layers to achieve the target. For the peace process and the women and the youth inclusion into the process, so the layers are, I think, the structures, the people, and the international support and some instruments. In a structure aspect, we have some formal ones like State Ministry for Peace, High Council National Reconciliation, and informal like some provincial networks which were created by the women groups and the youth groups to somehow promote the peace process and to advocacy and lobby for the youth and women inclusion into the process. And coming to the part of the people roles in the process, there is always a big question that where are the real place of the Afghan people in the process. They didn't see themselves in the process yet. And for sure, the international support is there. Coming to the women inclusion, despite women being the most affected by the conflict, they remain as a minor players in political life and the economy, and they are sidelined in the current peace talks. Afghan women must meaningfully participate in decisions that directly affect them. As women can play major roles, like being as a negotiators, being as a mediators, as observers, and in the technical teams. But when we see the current process, there are only 4 women representative in the negotiation team, and just 1 or 2 in the technical. There is no official group of women in observation and mediation, which is a big gap, which needs to be addressed. And this is really a big concern for the Afghan women as well. And yet now that the peace talks are underway, there are systematically excluded women from one of the most important decisions in the history of the country. Unless the government of Afghanistan, the Taliban, and the international community take serious steps towards including women, it will be a total disaster, and any agreement that is reached will be neither inclusive nor acceptable, durable, or peaceful. As according to the International Peace Institute, the inclusion of women in peace process has a great impact on their durability. Women's inclusion, it shouldn't be as a gift to be granted, but it is a strategic imperative. It is the Afghan women who, through these recent 20 years of activism, advocacy, and movements, they have established great access to the grassroots activities and to the local people. So they can very effectively contribute to facilitating a bottom-up approach in the Afghan peace process. Now we see that the peace process is from top to down. It's on the political side, and the political deal with the political leaders. But if we want to achieve it through a bottom-up approach, it's the Afghan women and youth who can play a major role to facilitate this process. And Afghan leaders, the Taliban, and other actors should take into account that Afghan women have great leverage on any peace deal, and excluding them will have an adverse effect on the peace process and the negotiations and peace building efforts. They have to rethink about their strategy and to adopt an inclusive approach to boost the chances for the peace. So the inclusion of Afghan women in the peace process is even more crucial when we consider the fact that the Taliban is not the only group that disregards the women. Afghanistan's patriarchal, discriminatory, male-dominated political and social system has also sidelined and overlooked women. So women's rights and interests will be sidelined twice over. They will be traded away and compromised by male representatives at the negotiation table who see them as a secondary, something to be taken care of good in another time. And this is very legitimate fear for many of Afghan women that we may lose the gains and the achievements that we made in the last 20 years. I will conclude that the Taliban, the Afghan government, and the international community should include Afghan women in any peace process, not just in formal discussion, but as a part of its design and implementation. It is not only the right of the Afghan women to have a place at any peace table, but their duty and responsibility, as they are half of the country's population. And in fact, they are half that has suffered more through these decades of war and conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Anwari. I'd like to now turn to Mr. Anush. The Taliban have made some effort to publicly reinvent themselves as a legitimate political entity and are courting new allies. They also claim that they represent communities in rural areas who have seen less development and less progress over the last 20 years, while also moderating their positions on women and minorities and urban residents. Could you tell us a little bit about what AMIP is doing to engage some of the harder to reach communities in Taliban-controlled areas? And can you share with us any insights you have found from the work of AMIP on some of the differences and commonalities of these different constituencies, both urban and rural?
Thank you so much. I'd like to start with recently, after the Doha agreement with the Taliban and the US government, the security situation has been deteriorating, and the hope for the peace is sort of being lost idea between the people of Afghanistan, including minorities and other people in the Afghanistan. But if we see the differences between the urban and rural areas in Afghanistan, there are huge differences, I think, in the rural and urban areas. In the rural areas, you see a lot of marginalized communities. You see that the government there is no institutional work in the rural areas, such as there is no government institutions cannot or do not provide the services to the people. The CSOs cannot operate there. The journalists, the medias are not present there. So the educational institutions cannot properly provide services to the people. So when we see that the awareness is very little in the rural areas. So when you come back to the cities, in the cities you see a lot of these developments are happening. A lot of the development projects are implemented, and the people in the rural areas, they must not want to go under the Taliban rule, but because there is no government presence, they have to accept the Taliban rule in there. So they have to accept the justice system that Taliban have established there. They have to go under that system. So that's like sort of unwanted going under Taliban control, because the government and the other institutions are not present there. And this marginalization, I think, have created the sense between the people that they are not part of the peace process in the Afghan peace process. And it has made it further difficult. And then the Taliban presence there it sort of make them alive with them. So this is, I think, the main differences between these. And Taliban are looking to win this situation with the war, with the increasing the violence, especially after the agreement. Now they are working on that hard to convince their allies, international partners, and even national partners that they can win this situation and they can bring the peace to the Afghan people. So this situation, the Taliban has gained more control. I was reading in last few weeks, they have gained so many, they are now controlling so many districts that government cannot take back. And the government is saying that we are strategically leaving these districts to the Taliban. So this is now the situation with the Taliban. And especially now with the increasing in targeted killings on CSOs, on media, women rights defender, this has also complicated further the situation. So with this situation, now to conclude this, we will say that the differences between the cities and villages, it has added to the complexity of the peace process, in the Afghan peace process. And the demands are also very different. In the cities, people want the same government to run. And the whole system, it's also very city-centric system, or even we can say Kabul-centric system. So to include people, there has to be a mechanism that we should go to the people and we should go into the villages, into the provinces and talk to the people. Very recently, a few months back, AMEP conducted an event with Turkmens in Mazar-e-Sharif. From across the 15 provinces, we invited the representative of Turkmens, and they want a full representation in the peace process. They want their voices to be heard in the peace process. Last year, CSHRN, the organization that I represent, together with another partner organization, we conducted a targeted survey in the 9 provinces where majority of the minority groups lives. So the finding of our survey suggests that 79.1% people believe that they are not involved in the peace process. And another question, when they were asked, above 50% of the minority groups, they believe that they are not represented in the peace process. So with these, considering all these points, I think that the inclusivity must be considered in the Afghan peace process. The consultation processes should happen with the different groups, minorities. Ms. Anwari mentioned about the women issues, but minorities are still a main issue. Mr. Karukhel mentioned about the targeted attacks about the schools and also Hazara community. They are raising their voices internationally on genocide, that the attacks should be considered as a genocide. And this is the situation now. People are completely sort of marginalized from the peace process in the Afghanistan. So with the AMEP as a transfer mechanism to give the voice to all the civil society in Afghanistan, that can facilitate the peace process. But first, the conflicting parties must listen to the voices of the people of Afghanistan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Anoush. I'd now like to turn to Dr. Antje Herberg. In the field of peace and mediation, inclusion is seen increasingly as a significant factor on what makes agreements hold or fail. At the same time, people talk about also the tensions between effectiveness in negotiations and inclusivity. Can you give us a little bit of a global perspective on the critical nature of inclusion and any lessons that we can take from other contexts on how inclusive processes can be designed in such a way as to lead to inclusive outcomes? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much, colleagues, also to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to this seminar and allowing to share my insights together with these distinguished colleagues. So I will add a little bit of an international or European perspective to this discussion. And maybe just to begin with, I just wanted to share a story when I held just last week oral exams as a professor of conflict resolution, where one of my students made the point in asking in the context of Afghanistan, why women really need to justify to be part of a peace process as they constitute 50% of society. So she asked, how can anyone question the need for a presence? Why and how come this needs to be proven, argued, and justified for? Now, this is the comment from a young woman leader who will probably go far. And it really shows that the work done by the previous generation is slowly paying off. Inclusivity, or at least the discussion about inclusivity, is an often discussed subject and has become really a matter of advocacy and even policy making. But the job is, as we can see, during these very critical times in Afghanistan, to do much more on this. So I'd like to make a few points about inclusivity to the Afghan peace process, which have been raised in various forms already today in this webinar. And I've been in both walks of life, working both for multilateral institutions as well as with and through civil society. And this really has shaped the advisory role I take also at the European External Action Service. Today, the European Union has developed a very specific policy framework for mediation, which we call the EU concept for peace mediation. And in our concept, we make a very strong point about inclusivity. We recognize that the role exclusion, grievance, and inequality have come to play as a driver of conflict. The EU, therefore, attaches great importance to goal-oriented and inclusive mediation approaches. For us, inclusivity is a norm and an objective. We state that inclusive approaches deliver strategic value for entry points for talks, they foster legitimacy, and they build trust between communities in order to make outcomes and agreements more durable. As such, the EU is a strong advocate of any approach that consults civil society and promotes, in that sense, also what we call multi-track approaches. We favor those all of society approaches to sustaining peace that focus to give a voice to all groups and leave no one behind. And here, for us, women and youth draw a particular attention from the perspective of meaningful participation. As a footnote, we make a commitment with the UN for including at least 33% of women in any peaceful process. Now, inclusivity, so the Swedish UN diplomat Jan Eliasson said recently, is the enlightened self-interest of state actors. The international expert community that I'm part of knows this. The policy community in itself has made the proclamation, but we have to make that inclusivity is something that substantially is part of the process or even is the process. Let me shortly make a key and critical distinction that we might not want to forget. Peace negotiations and a peace deal, and that of a peace process. Whilst the former peace negotiation is a formalized meeting amongst critical holders of power and a lead bargaining process concluding with a formal deal, a peace process is about extending dialogue between different stakeholders of society with the purpose of creating a sustainable dynamic of a dialogue that will be the basis of a new social contract in the society. Now, is the Afghan peace process, as we call it, really a process? And how do we make it a genuine process? Inclusivity in that sense, it's not just as a switch we switch on or off, or you can just ask mediators or negotiators to activate. It really requires careful engineering. It's a value-based approach in itself. We need to give credit, of course, to the processes that we have tried to advance inclusivity with civil society or certain groups. Syria, Yemen, Colombia, South Sudan, Philippines, or maybe the first Myanmar process, where a lot of good work has done in this regards. They are all laudable actions by individual mediators, organizations within the intention to make it work. But very often it has been the challenge to have inclusivity as part of, or really in itself, a structured, systematic, and inclusive process. Very often it is, for the very reason of the nature of the dynamics of peace negotiation, very stressful and extremely complex to bring in those individual voices. A peace mediation team, in my opinion alone, cannot handle a full inclusivity platform. New structures such as AMIP are really an answer to this challenge. The principle inclusivity takes therefore peace mediation to a really new level. And here we need to consider 5 key critical elements, which I would like to mention here. First of all, structure and process design. Now, how do you include the diverse voices and identities in a legitimate and representative way requires intricate design and expertise. It is preceded by analysis, even supported by digital data, mapping, deep understanding of the multiple voices and their meaning, and also an appreciation to make voices to be heard that might not be even for peace. At the same time, one needs to be able to ensure that inclusivity needs to be part of the overall and officially recognized peace mediation strategy. 2, empowerment. It is also about truly empowering such inclusivity, bringing testimonies to the process, letting voices speak for themselves. In turn, it means also that these voices need to empower rather than only criticize the peace process and become in that way a co-architect. It is about a house that parties build together and to recognize that neither one can do without the other, not to be afraid to hear the multiplicity of voices. 3, legitimacy and a mandate, and I think that's very important. In turn, that gives and it requires to give legitimacy to an organization and facility like AMIP that can structure and voice these diverse voices in a way that the peace architects understand and can work with, whereas the negotiation parties and the mediator need to provide a mandate to that facility or transfer mechanisms such as AMIP to be able to voice this and thus to be invited somehow at the table, and the organization to take care of this mandate with its constituency to work with through a careful communication strategy. This needs to be officially recognized, and I would recommend that the UN would officially mandate AMIP as a voice for civil society to this process, making therefore them part of the negotiations. 4, values. Inclusivity is a value. It needs to be safeguarded. It is about giving voice of, as I said, leaving no one behind. It needs to also recognize the deep-seated hatred and trauma of actors, not enforcing peace and dialogue, but really just giving a voice and recognition. It requires a professional practice that needs to be protected. How to do that has to do with the mission and mandate of the organizing framework. 5, and last, resources and finances. Creating inclusivity as we see it requires really a solid set of resources and empowerment. And the fact that the EU, amongst maybe others, is funding AMIP should be seen as a sign not only of a political commitment, but also one that is followed with financial deeds. To conclude, I really do hope that one day we will be at a stage when the entire word inclusivity might disappear, as it will be simply part of our life and practice. I think this is a motivation for all of us sitting here sharing their opinions. Thank you, Marika.
Thank you, Dr. Antje Herberg. We're about to close soon, but I would like to ask a couple more questions of our panelists. I wanted to turn back to Maryam Safi and actually touch upon some of the concepts that Antje Herberg brought up, especially around sort of mission and mandate and the ability of AMIP to be mandated, to give it an official mandate to sort of strengthen the role that civil society has in the process. In the work that you've been doing, I know that you've discussed about the MOU, but has there been also opportunity not only to present to the negotiators, but to actually have AMIP representatives sit at the table or to bring victims into the process? And what, and how, and if not, how do you also, as a transfer mechanism, bring some of the ideas that are being discussed by the negotiators or the proposals that that have been put forward by negotiators or by other actors back into civil society and to the communities.
Thank you, Marika. In terms of transferring or having victims present at the negotiating table, that is certainly one of the various key areas that we work at in AMIP. AMIP has the ability to create a safe environment where we can take victims to the negotiating table to be able to speak directly to both parties. And in the side event for the Istanbul conference, that was we were supporting a few different types of side events, and that was going to be a part of the side events to do that. That was something that was communicated to stakeholders. And I'm sure in the very near future, we will also be engaging in very similar activities. In terms of having a formal seat at the table, AMIP, as Mr. Karkhil also mentioned, has been talking with all sides of the parties and both negotiating parties as well, in addition to all the stakeholders that are right here in Kabul as well, like the HCNR and the State Ministry for Peace, etc., to ensure that in order for us to be able to formalize the consistent and systematic way in which we transfer voices table, AMIP requires a formal role on that table to be able to continue to do that. Now, there are lots of various different types of organizations that are, many organizations are in touch with parties and they're sending their documents and etc. The difference here is, and I'd like to mention, is that AMIP's role is, we don't do this in an ad hoc manner. What we transfer is consistently, and it's structured, and it's through focal points, and that sets it apart. A formal role would be very, very important for AMIP to ensure that all of these organizations that are working on the peace process subnationally in city centers formally get transferred to that table. And so AMIP is working towards that. And I think that AMIP has made considerable strides in the work that we've done with our partner organizations on the ground. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, and I can imagine it's no easy task to cohere and put in a structured manner all the myriad of proposals from civil society, as well as, from communities. We saw all the myriad of proposals that came out from all the political elites after the American proposal was put forward. And I wanted to ask a little bit on some of the both you had mentioned some of the major points that have been raised are around governance and around the ceasefire. And the American proposal somewhat sort of sparked this around sort of a system structure and what positions different folks may be getting. Have there been any discussions or proposals from the Taliban or from folks within Taliban communities on sort of their proposed structure and governance system?
You mean proposals to AMIP?
Proposals to AMIP or into the greater, to AMIP or within the sort of the broader civil society community that you work with?
At the present moment, one of the areas that not only AMIP, but I think the larger society here in Afghanistan faces is the lack of clarity from the Taliban negotiating side on precisely what type of governance structures would be what they would be looking towards. And also in terms of a ceasefire, the way we've seen it so far play out in the talks has been that a ceasefire is something that would be negotiated much later in the process. Before that, there are other issues that they propose to talk about, whether it would be a transitional authority for instance, that a transitional authority councils that can be created that can bring all the sides together, and then they can sit and choose a mediator and etc. And so I think having that and a few other issues, I think would be more important at this present moment. What we see as the most important, because that's what we are hearing from all the stakeholders, is that governance and ceasefire are the most important issues. And those are things that Afghans would like clarity on. But so far that hasn't come in. We as AMIP have, of course, we are an inclusive mechanism open to all civil society organizations, to either sympathetic to either party or to a cause in terms of what that may be in terms of unity, democracy, or ceasefire, reduction of violence, et cetera, et cetera. And that has been open, and we've communicated that.
Thank you, Ms. Safi. I believe we've run out of time, but thank you. I wanted to thank all our distinguished panelists for giving us a little bit more clarity on the importance of inclusion in the Afghan political settlement process and in a broader peace process, as Dr. Harburg pointed very carefully to us, and the difference between what an elite settlement looks versus what a broader peace process that can end violence in a sustainable way. I wanted to thank also AMIP for co-hosting this with us. And please do visit their website more for the work of AMIP, and also for some of the conclusions that they have reached, not that they have reached, but some of the interests and ideas and perspectives of the various stakeholders they work with. And also I wanted to thank the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. And if there's more for our listeners, please find more of our work on Afghanistan on the South Asia Center website. Thank you very much for watching, and please join me to thank the distinguished panelists for taking the time to speak with us today.